Mm. Well, good evening and welcome to you all and to those online as well. It's nice to have you with us. This is the last of the PC Forum events for 2025. We've had a program of 11 talks over 11 months from February until now, with well-credentialed speakers on what we've called challenges, questions and values we face in engaging with the church and the world. And with a theme like that, not surprisingly, every topic has been framed as a question. More of that anon. The only exception being the launch of Fergus's book. And we'd never like to think of Fergus as being questionable, and so that was the sole topic. It was not a question. Firstly, I'd like to start the meeting by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects, and on behalf of the rest of you, pay all of our respects to their ancestors and elders past and present. I extend this acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight and online. So coming back to PC Forum 2025, we have indeed focused on questions that I think many Christians face as they seek to live out an authentic faith in today's world. I said that 12 months ago, and I think the events of the last year have underlined that. It is indeed a challenging time in the lifetime of the world, when many of the world's old certainties are gone or in retreat, and we need to engage with a world in flux. In our program of presentations, as I've said, every item has been, bar one, a question. Tonight's no exception. We are to be led to explore, is making meaning a continuing task? To help us reflect meaningfully on what is a crucial question, our speaker has provided a handout, and I hope you all collected one on the way in. If anybody didn't, please see Kim, and he'll remedy that defect. But no, I think we all have a copy. Copies have also been emailed to those online. So anybody online who hasn't got an email with a copy of this handout, please get in touch with us and we'll make sure you get one. So very minor housekeeping notices. Many of you will know where the toilets are in this building. You've passed them as you came through the foyer. And if you can read male and female, I think you'll know which way to go. After this presentation, there's time for questions and we'll have supper in the side room. And as it is the last event of the year, I think Fergus has got something special planned for those of us here, so please enjoy supper with us. Deirdre Palmer is our speaker tonight. Dr. Deirdre Palmer served as President of the Uniting Church in Australia from July 2018 until July 2021. Prior to becoming President, Deirdre served as Moderator of the Uniting Church in South Australia from 2013 to 2016. Deirdre has been involved in theological education for much of her life. She has served on the faculty of the Adelaide College of Divinity, Flinders University School of Theology, and Uniting College in South Australia, and Perkins School of Theology, the Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Deirdre is also a social worker. She worked for 4.5 years with Uniting Communities as a counsellor with their childhood sexual abuse counselling team prior to becoming moderator. Currently, Deirdre is enjoying teaching, preaching and serving on a number of Uniting Church committees. She is actively involved in her local church, Brown Place, Uniting, where she is a member of their Social Justice and Action Group. And I think with an introduction like that, we are very delighted to be able to have such a well-credentialed speaker to speak to us tonight. So let me pass over to you, Deirdre, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Don, and thank you to all of you for gathering tonight, especially when the Ashes are playing in Brisbane. And probably there's some people online who've got the television on one side as they're watching. Thank you for the interesting question. Don asked me last year to consider this question, and a few people who I've talked to about it, of course, have said I could just say yes and we could all sit down and go for coffee. but is making meaning a continuing task? Your handout covers some of the headings that I will be walking us through, guiding us through, but from page 7, 8, 9 and 10 are the kinds of poetry and prayers and statements by people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who have offered us inspiring narratives of the way we might make meaning in our life. So that's a resource for you to take home. The rest of the handout will kind of guide us through the conversation this evening. So yes, making meaning is a continuing task, and I think it's a personal call to us throughout our lives to reflect on and explore the meaning of our lives, the narratives that shape who we are and how we act in the world. There is also a communal responsibility to create spaces where we can explore the meaning that we are making of our world and of our lives and of our faith. And this forum, the Progressive Christianity Forum, is engaged in this personal and communal work. As I thought about this question of meaning making, I've been reflecting on songs and poetry, scripture, prayers and psalms that have both carried meaning and shaped our meaning making for our society, for our Christian communities, and for me personally. One of my favourite songs of all time is Carole King's You've Got a Friend, that was written in 1971, and the tune may be playing through your head as I said it. I promise I'm not going to sing to you, but I want to read to you the opening verse and chorus. When you're down and troubled and you need a helping hand and nothing is going right, close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running to see you again. Winter, spring, summer or fall, all you've got to do is call, and I'll be there. You've got a friend. Now, when I was much younger, in my mid-teens in 1971, through to my early 20s, this song spoke to me of a deep longing to have a person or people in my life who were trustworthy, accepting of who I was, friends who were loyal and loving. And I was very fortunate to have in my life people who were trustworthy. My parents, the community of my local church at Seaton Methodist, and those off-again and on-again high school friends that you may be familiar with. While this song represents a longing for faithful, trustworthy friends, it also acknowledges and laments that people are not always trustworthy. And the song continues, they'll hurt you and desert you and take your soul if you let them, but don't you let them, just call out my name. It's important as we make meaning, as we construct a narrative about life, that built into that are views that take into account some of what we would consider key theological themes of love and grace, of good and evil. In my work as a social worker, I walked alongside people who've been abused by people that they should have been able to trust. They are very aware in their meaning making that in the world around us there are indeed people who will hurt you and desert you and take your soul if you let them. Some of the work that we did together was to reflect on narratives that were shaping their lives about the perpetrator, about the abuse, that shaped their life about who could be trusted, that shaped their view of the world, that sometimes it is a very unsafe place. And some of our work that we did was narrative therapy, looking at stories and alternative stories as we worked alongside those people. Now, while You've Got a Friend is about human friendship, I also saw, and many others at the time saw it, this connection with the friendship we experience through our Christian faith of Jesus as friend. And there were many sermons that were preached on this song at the time. So the ultimate friend, one who's always on your side, loving, accepting and forgiving. The one who in John's Gospel, Jesus says, I do not call you servants any longer, but friends, friends of God. And over the years, that song has remained an important one for me, even as my theology has shifted. As my experience and understanding of God, I hope, has expanded. The image and experience of God as friend has grown from Jesus as a friend that I learned about in Sunday school to a parent-child view of God to now Christ as an adult friend who is a companion God along the way. And as an aside, I got to see Carole King in concert at Festival Theatre in the last 10 years with that amazing piano, her voice and that great hair. Now you may ask, who conveyed to us that friendship and faithful relationship is important for our well-being, for our growth, for our development as healthy human beings? And it may have been my parents and other teachers in my life. And we could also answer that question in a multiple of ways. And I think one of the responses is it's grounded in our theology. You know, we believe that we're created in the image of God, who is love and who calls us to love God and love one another and to love ourselves, that we are made for relationship. Indeed, the Trinity is about relationship. And not any kind of relationship, relationships grounded in love and kindness and compassion. Relationships shaped by mutuality and equality and gentleness. And these relationships are set within a broader picture of God's vision for our whole creation, the God who created and declared those created ones and things are good. The God that we encounter in Scripture as one who calls us to do justice, to love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. And God's vision in Jesus, his embodiment of the reign of God, is expressed in good news to the poor, in freedom to the oppressed, in liberty to the captives and sight to the blind, and a jubilee year in which our debts are forgiven. And you'll recognise that that's also part of the Jewish tradition on which we stand. Now, this narrative, this meaning, makes sense to me, sense of my life, the world around me, the lens which at my best, through which I see other people. And it was a gift to me, a gift through the Christian community that nurtured my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, because the Christian community is a bearer of this narrative of Jesus that offers life-giving meaning-making. Now, for other people, meaning-making is shaped in other communities, other religious communities, non-religious communities, communities in turmoil, communities that are stable for a time, communities in transition. And our meaning-making is shaped by significant others, our family, our friends, our colleagues, our workplaces, our religious communities and our political and community leaders. And we're hearing a lot of those narratives in the world around us that are not necessarily life-giving, as Don's already referred to. Now, I want you to think about what particular songs or poetry or scripture or prayer carry meaning for you right now. How have they encouraged you in your ongoing meaning-making, that continuing task? So I'm going to give you an opportunity to get into pairs. You don't have to sing the song, you don't have to recite the whole poem, but what particular songs or scripture or poetry or prayers carry meaning for you? So you might like to do it in pairs or threes, and I'll give you 5 to 10 minutes to talk about that. Thank you for entering into that conversation. And if you didn't get a chance to finish the conversation, you might want to continue it over coffee, and you will have another chance to engage. You can see on the handout that I've given you that I've also included other biblical themes that may carry meaning for you, like I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And I think this is one that the Uniting Church has particularly emphasised in things like our vision for a just Australia, that, you know, God comes that we might live abundantly together. Romans 8:38 that we hear read at many a funeral, the idea that there's nothing that can separate us from God in Christ. Or Luke 10, which also comes from our Jewish tradition, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. And the Psalms, which of course were Jewish prayers that Jesus would have prayed. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. As we reflect on what brings meaning to us, I hope that our Christian communities, like this one, are places of deep reflection on the meaning of our lives and life-giving narratives that shape us in ways of love and justice and hope. Some of the things that I've said about some of the decisions that the Assembly made at the time that I was chairing the meeting as president, that I think if we had opportunities to engage more deeply about what we believe, about Scripture and theology, we may be in a better place. But we divide one another rather than entering deeply into people's meaning making. What makes sense for them? What are we hearing? And being open to that meaning making of others. And so that's a campaign that I continue to say, that our local churches, we shouldn't be at the surface. It should be inviting us more deeply into this faith that is meaning making. Now, when Don asked the question, is making meaning a continuing task? I immediately thought about the work of James Fowler. Now, some of you may be familiar with the work of James Fowler, and I want to talk a little bit about his work, but we're not going to go into great detail. So, making meaning is at the heart of who we are as human beings, and Deirdre Palmer is a Quaker educator who describes it as a fundamental human need. But meaning making is also a definition of faith. James Fowler, in his book Stages of Faith, The Psychology of Human Development and the Quest for Meaning, describes faith as the way we make and maintain meaning in our life. And he describes faith as focusing on centres of value and power that sustain our lives. And he contributed greatly to Christian education here in Australia. He's from the United States, focusing on growth and transformation and renewal throughout all of our life. Now, I've listed on your handout the stages of faith that Fowler addresses, but we're not going to walk through them all now because that would be another hour lecture on the various stages. But if you're interested in this, he's used the work of Erik Erikson on psychosocial development, the work of Jean Piaget on cognitive development, and Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development. And you'll see on the handout that he identifies 6 stages of faith. And one of them is a pre-stage, because the way he developed this understanding of stages was through interviews. So he designed an interview process. He did a lot of the interviews himself, and then he had students and other parts of his research centre ask these kinds of questions. And what he came up with was that in primal faith is typical of a 0 to 18-month person. And at that time, of course, you can't interview them because they don't have the capacity to speak. But he would say that going along with what Erik Erikson talked about, that's the stage of life where trust versus mistrust is what happens. So if you're an infant and you cry and someone responds, if you find yourself in a warm place, if they change your nappy, if they feed you, if you feel loved, you learn trust. And so Erik Erikson did a lot of work about that. And of course, our faith in God is founded in trust. So that has significant implications. Stage 1 is intuitive projective. And his names of the things are not particularly helpful, and spell check always picks it up. But intuitive projective would be typical of a 2 to 6-year-old. It's a time when there's episodic thought processes, they kind of have magical thinking, it's a rich fantasy world, and imagination is very important. In stage 2 of mythic literal, you have 8 to 12-year-olds. Their thinking is developing, so some of Piaget's work, they're able now to think from the perspective of another, of cause-effect reasoning. Storytelling is important to them. Their beliefs and morals are often taken literally. They understand morality as reciprocal fairness. And then precipitating to stage 3 are where we discover contradictions in stories that lead to reflection on their meaning. And that moves us to the synthetic conventional stage, which is typical of a 12-year-old and upwards. And that's when you're able to do formal operational thought, as Piaget would talk about, thinking about your own thinking. People in this stage are often idealistic and can be harshly judgmental. You may know some of these young people in our congregations. They look for mentors, people that actually embody the ideals that we talk about, and they're into mutual interpersonal perspective taking. So I'm looking at you, looking at me, and how you see me. Sharon Parks, who's one of the people who's done some research in this faith development, would say, for this age, it's the tyranny of they. What do they think of me? And at this stage, people are re-imaging God as personal. So often this is a time where people may have a conversion experience. They begin to see Jesus, in a sense, as the friend that we talked about earlier. Stage 4, the precipitation to that is as we develop critical reflection. And there's a clash between authorities and leaving home. And stage 4 is called individuative reflexive. It's often late adolescence. And people become more aware of social systems and structures. And you can see how this is important in terms of faith development, in terms of working for justice. It's not just about my personal relationships with other people and how I love them. Actually, we live in systems that oppress people and need addressing and advocacy. The precipitation to stage 5 is often recognising life's complexities and a dissatisfaction with simple answers. And that moves us into what he calls conjunctive faith, which is often midlife, and we begin to integrate earlier stages and earlier understandings. We're happy to live with ambiguity. We recognise truth in other traditions. We know defeat and irrevocable commitments, and we know what it is to give our life for others. That's a very rapid introduction to Fowler. But then I want to move into John Westerhoff, who I've listed there. John Westerhoff took Fowler's research and talked about 3 different pathways on which we journey to God, a pilgrimage that is a lifelong process. And I find his work very helpful. He talks about affiliative faith. So in a sense, Fowler's stage 1 and 2. He says, in an affiliative faith, we believe with the community. So what our church community, what our family, what our culture pass on to us. So we believe with the community. As we move into searching faith, which is typical of adolescence, he would say that at that stage, people begin to engage in critical reflection. They may no longer see things literally. They begin to reflect on what they've inherited. And then the third stage is integrative faith, where he would say our authority is no longer in the community or in the self, but is transcended the self and the community. And that's often a mystical path that people take. You may recognise yourself on some of those 3 pathways and the journey you've been on in terms of your own faith. Let me talk a little bit how I see these 3 pathways of Westerhoff. Most of my childhood was within a loving evangelical Methodist community that was focused on having a personal relationship with Jesus. So it was grounded in prayer, in personal and communal knowing of scripture and studying it, and a lot of music, a lot of 60s and 70s music. I was also influenced by the charismatic movement, the idea of a dynamic spirit who weaves us together in community, who gives us gifts to use and to build up the body. And sometimes what we may see or experience as supernatural, healing, speaking in tongues, prophecy, interpretation. When I came to study with John Westerhoff in the 20s at Duke University, when I was in my 20s at Duke University, I was quite disillusioned with the charismatic movement. I saw manipulative parts of the movement that I thought lacked integrity. And as I met with Westerhoff, I talked to him about this, how terrible it was, how I was so disillusioned, how I'd abandoned it. And he said to me that, at some point, you'll need to revisit and integrate this part of your life. Now, in my 20s, I wasn't very impressed with him saying that. Thought it was ridiculous. But I was eventually able to embrace that part of the movement that was attentive to the creative action of the Spirit in the life of the church and the world. And so when the Uniting Church engages in decision-making and we say we discern the movement of the Spirit amongst us as we come to decisions, some of that came from the charismatic movement and what it highlighted about the Spirit's action. So as followers of Jesus, as an educator, as a social worker, I want to actively encourage making meaning as a continuing task, as a conscious engagement. And together we can create those communities that shape and explore life-giving meaning-making. Now, to be able to do that reflection that I did, probably I had to leave Australia to have those kinds of conversations, get out of your familiar place. But also we need communities of trust and love and liberation, hope and wonder and healing and joy. And I think to be part of this forum, perhaps you've found those communities either in local churches or communities that you've created yourself that have given you that opportunity. And we can engage with others in the task of making meaning through listening to people's narratives, identifying narratives of hope. Part of my work in theological education and ministry leadership and social work is to ask, where do we hear the stories of hope? How do we identify them and build on them and encourage people's narratives of hope? And we may have opportunity to share some of our own and raise up stories of hope ourselves. I've talked a little bit in the handout about meaning making grounded in the Christian story and vision, and I've talked about the narratives of hope that are there. I've included a quote from Nelson Mandela because for me, he highlights these narratives of hope that come from the Jewish and Christian traditions. When he was released from prison, Nelson Mandela visited New York, and in his speech to Riverside Church in New York, he spoke to the gathered community about the hope-filled narrative of the irrepressible God who is seen in Jewish and Christian traditions as the one who is liberator. He said, "This day and this occasion, under these circumstances, would be utterly impossible, except for the truth that there is a God who presides over the affairs of history, who vetoes the schemes of evil people, and who decrees that truth, crushed to the ground, shall rise again." He went on to quote the prophet Isaiah. "We have risen up as on wings of eagles. We have run and not grown weary. We have walked and not fainted. And finally, our destination is in sight." It's the kind of narrative that sustained Nelson Mandela during his time in prison, during his commitment to the movement for liberation in South Africa. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of meaning making is that we need to have an accountable theology. Accountable, recognising that our education and our scholarship are not abstract or ahistorical ideas, but there are people outside of ourselves to whom we are accountable. The Mudflower Collective was a feminist group of theological educators who wrote a wonderful book called God's Fierce Whimsy, and they talk about an accountable theology, so that the way we speak of God, the way we think of God, the way we image God will influence our lives and the lives of the people around us, and it will influence the life of our planet. And we hope that over the years, as we grow in discipleship, as we go deeper in our journey with God, that we may have ever richer and multi-dimensional understandings of the Christian story to share. In sharing the Christian story and vision, Thomas Groom, one of my mentors, a Christian educator, underlines the importance of sharing the best version of the Christian story that we know, and to tell it as though it's not the only version. Now, I don't know about you, but the best version that I thought when I was 19 and 20 is probably not the best version that I think of now. But he says we need to faithfully tell that version, but not as though it's the only version. And for me, and I've included this in your handout, that kind of best version of the Christian story that I know right now will include these things, will be shaped by the inclusive, generous love and hospitality of God. It will be shaped by worldviews that are focused around an expansive love of neighbour, an inclusive love, reflecting God's vision of flourishing and abundance, of peace with justice for all people and the whole creation, and a self-understanding that invites us to embrace our fullest humanity. Now, in pastoral care, Jean Stephen Messner talks about narratives of hope and narratives of harm. And I think sometimes when we think about having an accountable theology, we need to examine when we have perpetrated narratives of harm as the church and as the Christian tradition. She would say that narratives of hope and harm come from our families, they come from our religious traditions, they come from our cultural context. The narratives that may speak of being survivors and being a resilient people who can take on any situation in life. It may be a narrative that harms us. Maybe you've heard, you're no good, you'll never make anything out of your life. We know that there are narratives of harm that have denied the voices of entire cultures. And we see that as we seek to be in covenant with First Peoples here in Australia. Our narratives of hope may be about love and compassion and peace with justice. Now, the changes in meaning-making that we've said, yes, indeed, there are changes in meaning-making, may change over time. Our meaning-making may be turned upside down and or deepened in the face of crises, in the face of suffering, in the face of transformative encounters and world events. And we hope that our meaning-making grows and is open to transformation and renewal. We may have unexamined narratives that play as a soundtrack in our heads that may remain unexamined unless something or someone or some event brings them to the surface. What if that which is your core meaning shifts or is challenged? For instance, I prayed for that friend or family member and they weren't healed. I trusted this community and I've discovered they weren't the loving community I thought they were. I trusted that friend and they're not at all the person I thought they were. And then we have events, global and personal, that turn the world upside down and may shatter our view of the world. The global pandemic is one of those that in our recent memory, the kind of violence that has been perpetrated around the world continues to destabilise our world and our view of the world. So how do you see the world around you right now? I was talking to a younger person, a child, a little while ago, and they just declared right out front, life is trouble. Now, I thought, well, that's not a very good thing for a child to think, and why would they say that life is trouble? You know, what's caused that? And so, I tried to put a counter-narrative, and I said, well, what about life is an adventure? Now, of course, life could be both at the same time. Life can be an adventure and trouble. So, how would you finish that sentence? Life is. Again, turn to your conversation partners. How would you finish that sentence? Life is. The way you see it right now. Hopefully you've all had a chance to finish that sentence. And it may be you want to talk about it over coffee afterwards or in question time. Life is. So shifting in meaning making can be precipitated by many things, and you know, in the next couple of weeks we might conclude that sentence differently. Life is. I've met some wonderful people who've gone through changes in their meaning making in incremental or devastating ways. And Joyce Branson was one of them. Some of you may know her. She was interviewed for the Progressive Christianity Network, and I met her when I was moderator down at Newland, and she was an amazing woman, incredible privilege. And she was in her 90s when I was talking with her. And she was talking to me about her life as a Christian and how there were things in Scripture that she questioned over time, and, you know, she wasn't always able to articulate those out loud. But when she discovered the Progressive Christianity Network and the work of Marcus Borg and others, it was like she came home. Here were people articulating what she had thought and was wanting to express and explore. So it was an amazing occasion for growth for her. It's an incredible gift when people are actually able to be in a community or in dialogue that makes that possible. And I think the Progressive Christianity networks around the world have helped that to happen. I would also hope that our local churches right across the board actually are safe places for that kind of exploration to happen. When I was doing my PhD study, I was in a different country. It was exhilarating. I came across new ideas about the Bible and God and church practices. And there came a time when maybe I thought, maybe I don't believe in God anymore. Maybe I don't believe this at all. You know, this is very stimulating and there's all kinds of different views. And it was like, you know, the game of Jenga that you play, you know, where you kind of build up the blocks. And if someone kind of grabs one and pulls it out, the whole thing can collapse. So when I was doing my PhD, sometimes it felt like that just one more thing and it would all collapse around me. At the time, I was worshipping in a Catholic community, and a beautiful sister of mercy, and she was a sister of mercy in a whole variety of ways, said to me, "Deirdre, sometimes the community needs to believe for you." Now, I could have said to her, that's a load of rubbish and I'm not going back. But it was a Catholic community that had beautiful liturgy, that was very accepting. And so at that time in my life, the community carried the meaning making for me. When I was doing my exploring and I managed to, in company with others, to reconstruct and reshape and find alternative narratives that enabled me to make meaning in a new way. So making meaning's not always a smoothly integrated system, and it can be quite painful at times. I worked with a student when I was teaching in Dallas who was a fantastic educator. She had a fabulous approach to education. It was about collaboration, it was about dialogue, being open to dialogue, being mutuality in the educational context. But she was living in a religious system that was very hierarchical, that told her women were not allowed to exercise leadership in their church. And so at that time at the School of Theology, she was grappling with, on the one hand, in her professional life, she embraced this wonderful approach to education. On the other hand, she was living in this community, so that didn't allow her to do that. And so for her, a lot of her time at the School of Theology was to kind of grapple with that. Well, what meaning do I make out of this? And how can I find alternative narratives that help me to live with integrity in this space? I'm going to have one more reflection, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Don, for any questions. What about when meaning-making clashes? When our view of the world dehumanises others and causes them to be diminished. So, for instance, man is the head of the household. Please don't take me out of context. This meaning has significant impact for women and children and our broader society. And in this week of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, we remember how this particular aspect of Christian theology has contributed to the oppression of and violence against women. This meaning-making is not all right. So what do you do when you're engaging with people for whom that meaning-making is significant for them? And so, a lot of my work in the life of the church has been engaging those kinds of questions. Well, no, I don't think man is the head of a household. I actually think Jesus modelled a discipleship of equals. And so, those kinds of conversations need to be had, because as Christians, we need an accountable theology that doesn't allow that kind of understanding to sit. The work that I did at Uniting Communities, we worked with women's groups who were talking about experiencing domestic violence, and some of them were still in those situations, and for some of them it was Christian theology that kind of perpetrated that kind of behaviour in their household. Another meaning-making is refuting the doctrine of discovery. It came out of a papal bull in the 1400s that relates to colonialism. And at the Assembly in 2015, we talked about the doctrine of discovery and said that the Assembly refutes this doctrine of discovery. The idea was that explorers were given the freedom and the foundation to take land as their God-given right, that the land was there to be taken. Doesn't that sound familiar in the Australian context? So colonialism and the dispossession and displacement of Indigenous people was grounded in that kind of thinking. So when meaning-making contributes to injustice and inequality and oppression and the devastation of other people's lives, their culture, their language, we are called to seek out alternative narratives and vision, which include truth-telling and confession and advocacy and working for justice and peacemaking. And this is the point where I do the advertisement, Don. I highly recommend to you this document, Our Vision for a Just Australia. This is a document that was put together by the Assembly Resourcing Unit in conjunction with justice staff and agencies. And in here, it has a vision of what the Uniting Church believes we are called to in engaging in justice in the world. And I want to read just briefly the paragraph about our vision. Our vision for a just Australia. Our vision, grounded in the life and mission of Jesus, is for a nation which is characterised by love for one another, of peace with justice, of healing and reconciliation, of welcome and inclusion. We see a nation where each person and all creation can flourish and enjoy abundant life. That is meaning-making for our nation, for our world, and if it shapes our lives, we will step into the abundant life that God desires for all of us and all creation. I'm going to hand over to Don. The rest of your handout has, I included the quotes that I thought were worthwhile and other things that you may find as an ongoing resource. So thanks, Don.
Don't go away, Deirdre. It's question time. And if the rest of you are anything like me, your mind is bubbling and bubbling with questions, but it's usually very hard to frame those questions. So let me invite anybody who'd like to come up here, and please do come up here because our online audience would like to see you and hear you. I know it's a daunting task to get out of your chair and come up here, but it's the best way if you can ask a question. Are there any questions from the audience? Come on now, there've got to be some questions. Come on, Esmond.
I think that when you make meaning as a kind of late teenager, early adult, you make it when you're very impressionable. Mm-hmm. When later information becomes available, how do you change from what was really impressionable to you to a more expansive understanding? And even how do we promote that within churches more so?
And, you know, that's an important question for young people who have been formed in particular ways. Now, the group that you were talking about that's coming here in February, they've actually been shaped in a progressive Christianity. So in a sense, that is their affiliative way. You know, they've been formed in that, shaped in that. So they haven't come out of an evangelical. So that's an interesting one. And it may be that in future years they'll push back against what they've heard in this kind of context and want to expand it and go further. So that's one of my responses to that. You know, depending on where you are actually nurtured and encouraged. You know, you may be nurtured in an atheist family, and that's the kind of meaning making that you make. And you will also go through those kinds of processes where you may reject what you've heard. And I would say that in those times, what you need is either a companion for the journey or a community that allows that kind of questioning. And some of my concern about sometimes the way we run youth ministry in our church is that young people are not always mixing across the breadth of the Uniting Church or nationally. And so they have a very limited view of what the Christian tradition is and Christian expression. When we were growing up and we had a synod-wide event or other things, we actually found other people who had maybe those kinds of views that we were also exploring. If we don't have a broader view, one of the dangers is that people drop out altogether. And I can think of situations where people are in a local community that restricts them so much in their thinking and feeling and expression that their response is to leave altogether. And that's why I think the beauty of the Uniting Church in terms of our interconciliar nature, that we're not just locally based, but we actually have synods and assembly and we can mix with other people. You can find a community where you can explore those questions that maybe the original community came from is not kind of free enough to do that. Does that make sense? I mean, James Fowler would say that a major part of the congregations in the United States are all at the synthetic conventional stage. So they're very conventional, they believe certain things and they expect their community to believe those sort of things. So it's very hard for a young person or someone precipitated to the fourth stage to actually find a home in that space.
Do we have another question? Right, the chairman's going to use his prerogative and ask a question, Deirdre. Fowler's stages of faith, page 2.
Yes.
Pre-stage primal faith. My thoughts immediately lurched to a person that I know very well, who never went through that stage. He was born as an orphan. He never knew his mother or his father, and he was left in a cot for 18 months, or less than that, a year, without any human connection whatsoever. He feels he missed out something. What happens when that happens, when you miss a stage?
Well, I guess Erik Erikson probably has quite a bit to say about that, you know, the trust versus mistrust. And when that doesn't happen, then part of it is kind of, you know, going back over and how do you discover those things? I mean, Erikson would say that every human being that reaches adulthood goes through his psychosocial stages. And the first one is about trust versus mistrust. And if we are in a scenario like that, then I think part of the work is, one, to have a companion work alongside that person. And of course, our social workers and teachers and other people are working with people and children who've experienced that. And the other thing is to find a supportive community. So one of the stories that I wasn't able to tell initially, and if I can pick this up, Don, I worked in child protection when I was doing a social work placement. And you may know that the child protection system, fortunately it's changed now, but at 18 you would age out. And so that's not the case anymore. There's been advocates so that young people get support beyond that. But this particular young person came into our office and they were having terrible trouble with their accommodation and they were being harassed. And I did the kind of thing that I would have done with the young people that I was working with. You know, who are your trusted people that you can work with? What are your networks? Is there somewhere else you could kind of couch surf or go on the night? The young person had no one. You know, they had been raised in a situation where they didn't have a significant other or carer, and the only one that they could go to was this fantastic social worker in child protection. And so I think, yes, there are the sort of standard stages of faith or psychosocial development, but as we know, there are many people in our community who don't actually have that kind of experience.
Thank you. Fergus, you've got it. Is that all right? No, good man.
Thank you. Now, that young person who you quoted said, life is nothing but trouble. Life is trouble.
Yeah.
You know, there's this amazing pandemic of anxiety and depression around the world at the moment, particularly affecting young people. I'm just looking at The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, who was just interviewed in an interview in The Australian on the weekend in relation to the new legislation banning social media for people 16 or under. So, and you know, it seems that there's this anxiety, this depression amongst young people. It's a real loss of faith or trust, a loss of meaning in life. So they don't. The young person doesn't trust in their parents. That's the first people line of trust in a young person's life. They don't trust society, don't seem to have trust in life itself, don't even think about God. Trusting God doesn't seem to come into the picture at all. So you've got this they've got these two things which seem to be in opposition to each other. Amazing anxiety, depression on one hand, and then faith and trust on the other. Can you talk to us a bit about the relationship between the two things?
Okay. You know, I work with people or am in relationship with people who do experience some of that anxiety and a lack of trust. And You know, I talked about listening to people's stories, about taking time to listen to other people's narratives, to be a good companion on the journey. And we talk about mentoring young people. And we have a whole community in the Christian community that can offer that kind of support. Now, one of the dilemmas, of course, is with the Royal Commission on the Institutional Response to Child Sexual Abuse. We know that in the wider society that the church is not necessarily seen as a trustworthy place. So we have a lot that we need to do in the wider society so that people see us as a trustworthy community for people to be part of. So I would say that part of our work is to take time to listen to our young people, to listen to our people in their 20s and 30s, maybe people like our parents or whatever, to listen to those narratives and to work with them to explore meaning making. I mean, some of the work that we did at Uniting Communities was narrative therapy. I've mentioned it before. You know, as you listen to people's stories, what are the alternative narratives that you can raise up that kind of addresses some of the anxiety that they may be feeling, or addresses the way they see the world? Yes, the world there's violence and there's lack of trust, but where do we see the signs of hope? You know, there may be signs of hope in this room. There may be signs of hope in our local church communities. Our place at Brome Place Uniting Church, I'd say, is a place that works alongside of young people and families to address those kinds of things. And it's a very long, slow process, but it is built in relationship. And it calls on us to have integrity as being and offering companionship in a way that we are trustworthy. So it's not a very good response to your question, Fergus, but I think it's about relationships, and it's taking time to listen to people and to work alongside of them, with the goal of inviting them into a space where they can find life-giving meaning.
I feel it follows on from talking about trust in the church. There's what I think is an absolutely fabulous book by Dr. Seuss, The Places You'll Go, which talks about not going down some paths. Do you have any insights to offer on the toxic paths that can be very bright and shiny, but I feel lead to a less loving destination?
What are some of the shiny things that you think of?
I guess I'm trying to think how to put it without being rude to people. Yeah, I don't know.
You mean
Things
in
that-
church or in
Well,
other
both
places?
really.
Yeah,
But I get the particular example that came to mind was, people who are antagonistic towards the church while claiming a Christian perspective, but it's not a loving perspective. If that's enough to be clear.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of what I was saying about an accountable theology and telling the best version of the Christian story that we know, when we see Christianity expressed in antagonistic ways and which divides us rather than brings us together, my response is to continue to emphasise the expansive, extravagant love of God, who is inclusive and invites us all in, who doesn't condemn us or judge us in terms of ultimate destinations, but it's a God who we see expressed in Jesus. So my counter to when I see those kinds of things happening is to continue to proclaim a gospel that's inclusive and loving. I think the most evangelical thing we can do as a church is to proclaim the expansive love of God that's beyond our wildest imagination. And to invite people into that life-giving space as a counter to what we see around us. Because we know there's various versions of Christianity and they're not all life-giving. So, and at the end of my handout, I talked about spirituality of resistance and transformation. So Nyambura Narega, who's a Kenyan theologian that I met in South Africa, she talks about that we need to resist all the things that would dehumanise us and cause us to be less than we're called to be. And so, you know, she's in a very difficult situation where there's suffering and injustice in her own country, but she would say that setting up that spirituality of resistance, you know, standing against all those things that would dehumanise and step into a space of transformation. And she says that we share the good news of the possibility of new life in the presence of death here and now. And it's a spirituality that invokes a passion that believes positive change is possible. So that's what the spirituality of resistance and transformation. We resist all those things, all those versions of Christianity that undermine our life as a planet, as a people, and undermine our sense of self moving into that abundant life.
Well, thank you, Deirdre, and thank you those who asked questions. Unfortunately, the clock has beaten us, so Deirdre, can I just thank you most profoundly for your talk tonight. It's been a very fitting conclusion to our program for the year, and in many ways wraps up some of the themes that we've touched on during the year. So would you join me in thanking Deirdre? But there's more. I'm not going to offer you steak knives, but next year we have another program of 11 talks beginning in February and running through to December. The task group has been working in quite difficult circumstances in a flurry of emails. I've never seen anything like it. You had to be tuned in most of the day to catch all the emails coming and going. But we now have a program of 11 talks pretty much shaken down, and you'll hear about it shortly when the brochure is produced and the information goes out. So please join with us next year, and we guarantee that there'll be something to shake your world up, something to inspire you, something to usher you into a wider community that Deirdre spoke about. Now, the most important thing perhaps is to join us in supper, where there'll be a chance to talk further amongst ourselves and with Deirdre. So please join us as we adjourn next door for a cup of tea, coffee and some nibbles. And Fergus has